Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Paikin, and we are here on the site of the former Royal Canadian Air Force Station, Downsview, for the first edition of TVO Today Live for 2026. This is Hangar A of the Bombardier Center for Aerospace and Aviation at Centennial College's dedicated aerospace campus. It's all part of the DAIR Hub, D-A-I-R, Downsview Aerospace Innovation and Research. And we are here because in what seems like an increasingly dangerous world, Canada is revitalizing and restoring its military. This site once cranked out de Havilland Moths and Mosquitoes for World War II Allied forces and was an active RCAF base right up until the 1990s. For decades, Canada punched well above its weight militarily. That waned as funding and, frankly, interest shrank. Now, with billions reallocated to rearm and revive it, what kind of fighting force can and should Canada have? And how do we equip for that mission? Before we start, I want to say thank you to Red Wilson. He heads up the Wilson Foundation. Ever since this TVO Today Live series began, Red Wilson has been there for us, offering us the support and funding we need to do these programs. So, Sheldon, take a shot of everybody here. We got an overflow crowd on the bleachers at the back there, and everybody gets in for free because Red Wilson is underwriting this whole effort. So thank you so much for that. And we are also happy as well to thank the Jackman Foundation, which has now come aboard, and their additional support is most welcomed as well. Now, we are delighted to have with us for this conversation today, General Wayne Eyre, retired Canadian Air Force's officer with more than 30 years in the service, and among several distinguished commands and deployments was Chief of Canada's Defence Staff from 2021 to 24. Wendy Gilmore, who for more than 3 decades served in Canada's Foreign Affairs and National Defence Departments, including at NATO as Assistant Secretary General for Defence Investment. And Christian Leuprecht, professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and Queen's University, and the editor most recently of Military Operations in Response to Domestic Emergencies and Global Pandemics. And how about this audience welcoming our guests here today? Thank you for coming in. The impetus for this program was a huge bump in defense spending announced in the last federal budget, an $81 billion funding package for the Canadian Armed Forces. And I introduced you as Air Force. I meant to say Armed Force, Canadian Armed Forces.
I wasn't going to correct you, Steve.
You should have corrected me. But as soon as the word came out of my mouth, I thought, that doesn't sound right. Anyway, Canadian Armed Forces, including a Buy Canadian procurement program. But before we even get to that, for many people, there's an elephant in the room. There's a lot of planes in the room, but there's an elephant too, perhaps shaped like Venezuela or Greenland. So let us begin with the, what shall we call it, infuriating relationship we're currently having with our neighbors to the south. General, when you were the CDS, Chief of Defense Staff, you underscored that whatever peace and security exists in the world is thanks to an agreed upon international rules-based order. According to our Prime Minister, that's done. It's over with. How concerning is that for our military?
Well, it should be very concerning, and we've seen this coming for some time. In fact, in 2022, I said publicly that we were at a turning point in that global order, and what we see coming from south of the border is an accelerant to that turning point. Hey, let's face it, all global orders come and go. We've seen this for 500, 600, 700 years, but it's a period, or it's a cycle of order, disorder, reorder. We are entering the disorder phase, and until we find a new equilibrium, there is tremendous opportunity for miscalculation and bad things to happen.
Wendy Gilmore, how should we react to this moment in our collective history?
I tend to think of the British adage for keep calm and carry on. We have to understand what's going on. We have to react as calmly as possible to events. Statements from President Trump in the South, international events writ large, changes in the world trading order, they will all impact Canada. But what is most important is that we focus on getting our own internal processes right and that we remain as resilient as we can.
How do we keep calm in the face of all of that?
Well, my personal opinion is that if you're faced with a bully, you stand up and you say what is right, and you try and calibrate your approach to taking into account you're protecting your own interests. But at the same time, we have to be aware, especially when our relationship with the Americans is concerned, is that we're not putting up a wall. They're not going away. We have to find a way to work with an administration, even if we may not be completely aligned or aligned at all in what it is that they're doing right now.
Christian, your view.
So look, this is the 250th anniversary of George Washington during the Revolutionary Wars with his armies through Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu marching on Quebec City, where he was, of course, beaten back by British troops. War of 1812, Oregon boundary dispute, we think back to the Nixon era. Look, the relationship with the United States has always been difficult, and it's been difficult for two reasons. One is that the United States has always been unilateral, and it asserts its interests, and it has long asserted its security interests unilaterally in the hemisphere, going back to the Monroe Doctrine. The other is that if you think back to Arthur Schlesinger's 1973 book, The Imperial Presidency, we've long seen an expansion of executive power in the United States from Washington through to Richard Nixon. That was then constrained by Congress. But what Schlesinger points out, that these powers, executive powers, expand particularly during times of conflict and during times of war. And you might say that we live in a time of certainly heightened conflict. If you look at Russian and Chinese doctrine towards the West, you might say we live in a time of war. And so the expansion of executive power fits with the broader historical pattern that comes at the expense of Congress and at the expense of checks and balances. But I think my broader point is anybody who hopes this is just a momentary lapse of reason and we'll go back to the status quo ante, that's not going to happen, so we better get ready.
No, we've always had, an occasionally fraught relationship with the United States, but in your experience, has it ever been like this before?
No, certainly not. We have enjoyed a fantastic relationship. There's been ups and downs, but certainly from a military perspective, it has been strong, certainly over the course of my 40 years of service. I would like to think that strength of relationship continues, if nothing else, to maintain a personal relationship so that 10, 15, 20 years from now, if we're dealing with a sensitive issue, that our commanders at the time can pick up the phone and sort it out. I think it's in our best interest to do that.
Do you know whether, because one of the reasons Donald Trump said he needed Greenland was because of the persistent present threats by either Russia or China in that part of the world. Do you know if there are any credible threats that have been picked up there?
The area between Greenland and the United Kingdom, centered with Iceland in the middle, has been an area of focus throughout the Cold War. Because if there are, if the threat is coming from Russia, and Russia has nuclear submarines with missiles that could threaten North America, the area that they are most likely to come down is what we still call the GI-UK gap. Greenland itself as a territory is strategically located because of the ability to place different types of sensors on it that can see, and we call over the horizon, over the Arctic and elsewhere. But one of the things we have to remember is that Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark have been integrally part of the defense of North America since the Second World War. The Americans had troops during the Second World War that were ensuring that Greenland wasn't used as a base for weather stations or other types of surveillance. Since the end of the Second World War, since 1951, there has been a treaty between the United States and Denmark that allows the United States fairly unfettered access to Greenlandish territory. It was updated in 2004 to encompass the interests and, frankly, the autonomy of the Greenlandish people. So it is inexplicable to me why there is this fixation from President Trump and his key advisors on owning Greenland when Greenland has always been incorporated into the defense of North America completely seamlessly.
What do you think accounts for the fixation, to use Wendy's word, for the president on Greenland?
So the gap is critical, for instance, in terms of communications. So 95% of digital communications between Europe and North America run through critical infrastructure cables that run through that gap. Russia and China have repeatedly demonstrated they have the capabilities and the intent to cut communications. And this has long been sort of the red line for Russia back to the Soviet Union in terms of protecting its nuclear assets in the Kolan Peninsula and the Russian fleet in the Murmansk Peninsula. So yes, so we have aggressive Russian submarine activity. We have some collusion by Russia and China. But to some extent, this is no different than what we saw during the Cold War. What we have seen is an atrophying of capabilities to contain that, in particular anti-submarine warfare capabilities, but some of those were political decisions, going back to Pierre Elliott Trudeau in terms of strategic ASW, deciding for Canada that it was actually destabilizing to engage in strategic ASW. So we had already
ASW?
Anti-submarine warfare capabilities.
But if I can say, Christian, that atrophying of capability is not just Canada, it's not just Denmark, it's also the American capability. The Americans have not invested in high north Arctic capabilities to the extent that I believe now they probably had wished they would, but it's collective decision on the part of all of the allies.
So yes and no, because I think we need to ask, what is the threat in the Arctic? Is the threat actually different from what it was during the Cold War? Are the Russians going to show up with special forces that they're going to deploy on some Canadian territory or so? And I'm not sure the threat is that much different than what the threat has been previously. If you look at the US Navy, for instance, the US Navy has never really been interested in the Arctic. Much of this is left up to the US Coast Guard. And so from a Canadian perspective, we need to ask, what is it that we're looking to defend against? And my sense is we need to distinguish between threats in the Arctic and threats coming through the Arctic. My sense is threats in the Arctic are not that different from what they were before. And if you're going to send a missile to North America, and if you're Russia, it's much more efficient to send that missile, for instance, from the Pacific off the coast of Alaska or off the West Coast than it is from the Arctic.
Christian, don't give them any ideas, please. All right. Anyway.
So, Christian, I would take some exception to the situation is not terribly different from the Cold War. You know, what we have now is perhaps unprecedented in history, a confluence of stressors in the security environment: geopolitics, climate change, and technological change acceleration. And those three operating together will create a very uncertain future. Climate change. The Arctic is becoming much more accessible. With increased access comes increased interest. With that increased interest comes increased opportunity for tension. You have an opening up of potential for resources, overlapping maritime claims, the ability to transit, which greatly reduces shipping times from China to Europe. We're seeing an unprecedented alignment between potential adversaries. Here I'm talking Russia and China. You know, the Arctic traditionally was a wedge issue between the two of them. And it goes back to the 1800s when Russia seized Chinese territory. But not so much anymore. And we're seeing increasing joint exercises in the Arctic, joint bomber patrols. And so when we talk about the Arctic, we've got to be thinking in strategic timelines.
When you were Chief of Defense Staff, did you ever think to yourself, boy, we are really vulnerable in this neighborhood in the world, and I really hope the United States someday either invades or somehow owns Greenland to make sure we stay safe?
Absolutely not. When I was Chief of Defense Staff, I was the one arguing we've got to do something about this, because if we don't, somebody else will.
Yeah.
Wendy.
I would also say that I come back to the importance of the alliance in addressing all of the issues that General Eyre just mentioned. We have a collection of what were 32 like-minded countries. Perhaps, one of the countries is less like-minded than it used to be.
Which one would that be?
That would be the United States. With respect to, we approach these issues collectively and we decide how we're going to address them that, number one, makes best use of our very limited resources. And I agree completely that more resources are needed. But most importantly, reinforces the idea that we value each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that's what we're trying to protect. The one thing that I always like to remind myself and others about the Arctic is that it's not just a vast, white, uninhabited territory that can be used as some pawn on a chessboard. There are people living there. The Greenlanders have sovereign ability to decide on their own future. They have so far decided that's within the Kingdom of Denmark. Our own Arctic peoples have treaty relationships with the Crown. They have rights in their lands, and their ideas and their interests have to be taken into account. And they also appreciate that there is more interest in their territories, that there is more access to their territories, that as global warming continues, and frankly, our desire for all sorts of resources increases, that there's going to be more outside interest. But their concept of what constitutes a security threat could be very different from ours, and that has to be taken into account.
Christian.
Yeah, so I agree with General Eyre in the sense, and with Wendy, that absolutely there's a change in scale and in pace of what's happening in that area. But I think it's also a function, there's a lot of continuity. I mean, 166,000 kilometers of coastline, an area that is larger than all of Europe. But if the threat was really that big, look, we have 8 military bases, and on a good day, we might marshal 8 CF-18s, 3 frigates that don't make it up into the Arctic. We have Arctic patrol vessels that we built that have limited capability in the Arctic. You know, would we have an entire brigade in Latvia if the threat to this country sort of was genuinely so big? But I think there are certainly changing threats. So hypersonic weapons, for instance, and the missiles sort of that Russia is deploying, these are certainly a change in scale. And so having Cold War era radar stations, for instance, is simply not going to meet the moment. And if you look at the new US defense strategy, it is very clear. We want to work with allies in terms of protecting our interests, and we want to work with partners and allies in the hemisphere to protect the hemisphere in particular. And if allies and partners are not going to work with us, then the US will do it unilaterally. That's why the US keeps.
I heard the last part of that. I don't recall hearing the first part of that, which is that we want to work with our allies to ensure the safety of the hemisphere.
It's in the just released defense strategy. It says so explicitly, and it mentions Canada explicitly in that context.
Well, let me pick up on that. In your experience, how intertwined were Canadian and American military officials, soldiers, strategies, et cetera, in order to do all the things we've been talking about?
So first, let me go back to Christian's comment. This is nothing new. Often when I would meet with my American counterparts, and this is under the Biden administration, the Arctic was at the top of their list of talking points. What are you doing about the Arctic? So what we need to do is make ourselves the indispensable partner in terms of securing the Arctic. So again, somebody doesn't have to do it for us, and when we lose sovereignty in the process. Now, Steve, to your question, we are very interoperable. I myself spent 2 years on exchange as a deputy commander of a airborne corps, number 3 in the headquarters, with 105,000 troops under command. So there is a high degree of trust, and that comes from decades and decades of working together.
Which administration was in control when that was happening?
At that point, that was the Obama administration.
Okay, so not Trump,
But
in other words.
subsequently, I was in Korea as a deputy commander to an American 4-star. In fact, I was in the demilitarized zone when Trump visited with Kim Jong-un, so that's a whole other story. But those relationships run deep.
Yeah.
Wendy?
I think like General Eyre, I absolutely believe that we have to foster and continue the professional relationships we have, and frankly, people-to-people relationships across the border. Canada and the US are never going to be separated from one another. We also have to have a very clear-eyed view of the intent of the current administration. And yes, they have a new defense strategy that has been released further to their national security strategy. And while it mentions allies and partners, it's very much in the context of, if we think they're useful, we will use them. If they are working in our interest, there's no sense of a collective interest of what is good for all, which is frankly what the whole NATO alliance is based on. And so then, what I do agree absolutely with the sense that we have to step up, we have to make these investments, we have to do them even more quickly in our own capabilities so that we defend ourselves, and I think there's been some academic research, defend ourselves against help. The Americans are going to do it one way or the other. We have to prove that we are there first and capable so that we can avoid the ultimate loss of sovereignty that will result if they decide that something needs doing and we're not prepared to do it.
But I think, Christian, both sides, both countries, Canada and the United States, saw it as in their mutual interest over the years to have this relationship, this interoperability, because we've had a decent level of trust with each other. And I'm wondering if today we can say this relationship may look more like a liability than an asset. What do you think?
Well, so let's think back of how this came to be, right? So it came back to the beginning of the Second World War and the US concern that Canada may not be able to defend itself if attacked. And so a proposal by the US that the Americans might need to deploy troops on Canadian soil, to which the Canadian Prime Minister at the time struck a quasi sort of strategic agreement with the United States that we would work together to keep the threats of the world as far away from our shores as we can. This then translates into what the US calls sort of the rim strategy. So you want to keep the threats on the Atlantic rim and on the Pacific rim and work with allies and partners there, and in relationship with Canada to be able to assert that. And I would say that strategy has made North America the most stable, the most prosperous, possibly the most desirable continent in the history of the world. And I worry that we have forgotten, especially as Canadians, what got us to that special moment that Canada is in today. Because I think we've forgotten that strategic dimension of why we got into that relationship with the United States in the first place. Now, we might disagree with the perspectives that the United States has and that how the United States looks at the world, but look, in the antiquity, the center sort of the world was, from a Western perspective, the Mediterranean. That then shifted with sort of colonial modern sort of times to the Atlantic, and clearly that center of gravity is shifting to the Indo-Pacific. So we have a significant sort of restructuring of global dynamics, and I'm not sure that Canada and allies sort of have really sort of kept pace with that over the last 25 years. And we love to complain about what's coming out of the US administration and so forth. But I would also say we need to take some responsibility.
Well, that's it.
Because we've let our capabilities atrophy for 25 years.
Let's be blunt about this. We've been seen as the laggards in NATO for 50, 60 years, right? That's fair to say.
Well, Canadian military history is one of unpreparedness. If we take a look at 1914, 1939, 1950, 2001, 2022, we have not been ready. Well, now the signs are clear. We've got to be ready. The currency of international relations is now hard power. You want a seat at the table, you got to have something to back it up. A country's military is its ultimate insurance policy, and we have not been paying the premiums.
How important to NATO has Canada been?
So I take some umbrage at the thought that we've been seen as a laggard, certainly not throughout the course of NATO. Canada, we have not invested in domestic capability because we have had significant capabilities in Europe. Up until the early 90s, we had a brigade, land forces, we had air forces. We have always been part of Standing Naval Fleet Atlantic. Since then, we have been in an operational capacity in every operation that NATO has had.
But we've never hit 2% of GDP.
Since 2014, when the 2% target was established, no, we haven't. And there, I would be the first and frankly have argued over the course of my career that we need to be investing more, we need to have done it earlier, and we need to have done it better. That being said, whether we consider a 2% an arbitrary target and whether we will have succeeded when we hit 2% is to me a complete misnomer. We need to make a realistic assessment on what it is that Canada needs, put a value against that, and get on with the business of investing. I would just, not to complicate things unnecessarily, but the 2% figure and what is now actually a 5% figure is a costing of what are the military assets that are required in order to meet the plans that have been established for the defense of the Euro-Atlantic area under NATO, SACEUR's area of responsibility, Supreme Allied Commander Europe. That doesn't include North America. So if we were being completely realistic and we wanted to play our part in the current NATO operational plannings, our target would have to be a lot more because we have other things to do other than simply defend Europe.
Having said that, how confident are you that the announcement that the current Prime Minister has made that we're going to go to 5% of GDP for military spending, that's actually going to happen?
Well, one thing that the military does not have the luxury of is determining what political decisions are going to come out and whether those political decisions are going to be upheld in the years to come. I just want to go back to Wendy's point on defense spending. Hey, the percentage of GDP is not a good metric. That is an input metric. Much better defense planning is threat-based. So you take a look at the threats the country is facing and you determine what capabilities and readiness are necessary to address those threats. Very, very difficult to do. So NATO settles on this input metric. It is far from perfect, but it is a target nonetheless.
Well, that's the thing. It may be far from perfect, but it's the one that everybody's agreed upon and the one we've never hit. So does that not make us look a little weak in the eyes of everybody else?
Yes, it does. And I saw Canada's stock in free fall in the period 2022, 2023, certainly after Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine in February of 22, where our allies were increasing their spending, were increasing their investments, and we were discussing.
Discussing. Is NORAD still a big deal for Canada and the United States, in your view, Christian?
I think it is a big deal in terms of functional arrangement, but it's also symbolically a big deal. And it's a really important question for us to ask. Because, for instance, I think personally, my view, if we didn't buy the F-35, that would be a huge irritant to the Trump administration, and it might accelerate an atrophying of NORAD that we've already seen. We've seen an atrophying as a result of technological change, in particular the weapon systems and radar systems. But we've also seen an atrophying as a result of organizational and restructuring. And the latest of that is, of course, the announcement of the hemispheric or Americas commands, so taking the 6 combatant commands and territorial commands and putting them into an international and the hemispheric command. And we've seen the defense strategy, the mandates for that command. That might be more difficult to reconcile with some Canadian priorities in terms of sort of narco-drug trafficking in the Caribbean and stuff, although we've always had a role in this. So one of my concerns is that we want to hang on to NORAD, both for functional reasons, because why do we get into NORAD to begin with? Because we would never have, as a modest economy, the capabilities to defend the Arctic on our own. And so we needed this functional arrangement. But if it is atrophying, for a host of reasons, then that means the prospect of more US control of the Arctic, which cannot be in Canadian interests ultimately. So we need strong capabilities in the Canadian Joint Operations Command, not just for the purpose of force projection and contributions across the Atlantic and the Pacific, but in terms of continental defense in order to work with the Americans ultimately at eye level. And that is good not just for our continental defense, it is also good for our political and our military arrangements, because whether it's NORAD or NATO, if you don't have robust instruments of statecraft, your voice is going to be significantly diminished in both the binational relationship and in the multilateral relationship around the table with NATO.
General, you wanted to add?
Well, I'll just jump into what Christian was saying there. The functional part was really driven home to me when we were shooting down balloons in early 2023 as they were coming in from the Western Pacific over Alaska. And that integration or that early warning of what was coming was quite frankly essential. What we need, though, on the functional piece, and this is what the Americans want of us, is they see a key vulnerability, if you look at the continent, from the 10 o'clock to the 2 o'clock position over Canadian territory. It's not covered with sensors. How do we make ourselves the indispensable partner through Canadian sensors that go right from space to the seabed so that we know what is happening in our territory and the approaches to it?
Can I ask you about this new national defense strategy or national security strategy that the Americans unveiled towards the end of last year, which basically said, I'm going to paraphrase for simplicity here, but basically said the Western Hemisphere is ours and we'll do whatever we like. And, you know, if it's theirs, the presumption is, I guess we're not part of it anymore. I don't know. How much should all of that determine what and how we spend our money on to rearm ourselves for defense purposes?
I think it's important, but I would also go back to the keep calm and carry on premise. We need to do, I believe, Canada needs to look, what do we want to be able to do for our own security? Where are we prepared to do it on our own and pay for it? What do we need to do with our allies? And in particular, I mean, again, we're not losing the Americans, no matter how difficult or good, easy they are to work with, hard they are to work with, they're still going to be there. So we have to figure out how do we bring our own capabilities to the table so that we get a voice. And I would come back just quickly to NORAD. I spent 2 years as the political advisor to Commander NORAD, American commander. I was a Canadian diplomat sitting at his sort of, behind, occasionally whispering in his ear.
Was that ever awkward?
It was, I thought, a real privilege because we have in NORAD a treaty-based relationship that looks explicitly at certain areas of our security: aerospace control, aerospace warning, maritime warning. In those areas, Canada and the US have established processes and procedures and command relationships where we are working seamlessly together.
So how'd you feel a few days ago when you read in the Globe and Mail that we're drawing up plans to defend ourselves from a US invasion?
I think we should have the whole point, and I would look to my wonderful colleague, General Eyre, the whole point of a military is that they are the best planners in the world, and I would like to think they have plans for as many contingencies as possible, whether it's an invasion from our neighbors to the south, whether it's, pick your threat. It has to be threats. Risk is based on the possibility of a threat happening and the consequence if it does happening, and you put your resources in as that dictates. But I guess what I would come back to with the states is that we have to find a way to work with them, irrespective of who is in charge or how much we may like or not like what they're saying. And the best way we do that is by coming to the table with capability, with sovereign control over our own territory, meaning that we can deploy our own resources. One of the biggest challenges, I would say, just to finish this thought in NORAD, is that when we went up to look at balloons, we only have a certain amount of capability that can track that balloon or whatever the threat happens to be, the track of interest across Canadian territory. And at some point we say, well, we can't do it any further. We need American refueling. We need the American sensors. We need possibly American planes in one instance, as I recall, to actually take that threat down. Well, then the United States says, yes, we're in this relationship. We're going to come and do it for you. But hey, Canada, again, you really need our refuelers, you really need our airborne early warning capability, whatever it happens to be.
At some point.
Exactly.
Okay.
We need to come to the table with stuff.
Christian and then the general.
So both really important points, because the US military is very busy with the capabilities it has. And I think there's a message about all these things where we help you with, you're going to need to do on your own because we have a bunch of other priorities. A slight correction, if I may. The national security strategy and the national defense strategy
different things.
are two separate documents. In national security strategy, Canada shows up once. In national defense strategy, it shows up 3 times. That also gives you a bit of an idea of there is a role for Canada to play here. And the role for Canada to play is, the way I always sum this up is, the Americans are our best friends, whether we like it or not. And the Trump administration, I think, understands that, right? It's not like we have a host of options. Who are we going to ally with? Russia, China. So in that sense, I think the capabilities question is absolutely critical. And I think one of the things Canadian governments have never done very well with our European allies is 2 things. Europeans think NATO is about defending Europe. They forget that NATO actually has 3 pillars: Europe, North America, and the transatlantic space. We do a disproportionate amount of heavy lifting in protecting that transatlantic space, in terms of, in particular, tracking Russian submarines, for instance, and in continental defense. Why is continental defense so important? 2 reasons. One is, we don't want to be extorted in terms of our sovereign political decisions that our legitimately democratically elected governments in Ottawa and in Washington make when it comes to our interests, our security, and our defense. And if our adversaries can threaten us with very dangerous weapons that currently in Canada we would have very little capacity to defend against, then that effectively sets us up to political extortion by those adversaries. Also remember, those weapons in the 1950s, this was a flyover problem in terms of the Arctic in Canada, and they were going to hit the United States. Today, if you hit Canada, it would have just as disruptive an impact on North America as it would if you hit the United States. The other is, of course, if we believe as Canadians that we don't want nuclear proliferation in the world, and I cannot think of any reason why we would, then we need to protect extended strategic nuclear deterrence from the United States to our partners and allies. Because if they believe that that extended nuclear deterrence is no longer credible, then you will have partners and allies in both the Indo-Pacific and in Europe acquiring their own nuclear weapons. And that cannot possibly be stabilizing for the world. And we need to explain that an investment in continental defense and in national defense for Canada is an investment in NATO. And to Wendy's point, I think we've not communicated that well, and it's not well understood.
General.
So there's a whole bunch there to unpack. I want to add a few points. Hey, let's face it, U.S. is not going away, China's not going away. We're going to have to coexist. But how do we coexist from a position of strength or being strong enough, but also from a position of confidence in ourselves? I've seen a lot of hotspots around the world, a lot of countries in trouble, a lot of failed and failing states. We've got it good here in Canada. We've got a country that's got a tremendous amount going for it. We just need to, we have a proclivity of gazing at our navels and beating ourselves up. But no, we need to find that sense of confidence and see ourselves through this challenge. These documents, National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy. National Defense Strategy came out yesterday. Every administration puts them out. It's a cycle, it's good, it's in their law, we can learn something from that. My concern, and it goes back to my initial comment about a period of disorder and miscalculation. As potential adversaries look at these documents and see the focus on the Western Hemisphere, could that miscalculation be giving them license to do something in their own so-called sphere of influence?
What do you think?
Taiwan, Eastern Europe, Russian hybrid warfare, seizing some of the former Soviet territories. Don't know. One of the challenges is we have adversaries, authoritarians who've surrounded themselves with yes men who share that same worldview, and any competing perspective, well, if you're lucky enough not to fall out of a window,
Not to put too fine a point on it, but yes.
You're dismissed.
Yeah.
And so the analysis that they might be getting could be rather shallow. And if they see these documents, could it cause miscalculation? That's my fear.
So if I would just very quickly come and say, which to me is the heartbreak over the last few weeks worth of churn with respect to President Trump's threats against Greenland, because there are real threats. We have an active conflict in Ukraine perpetrated by Russia. We have deaths happening every day of civilians, of military members. We haven't been talking about Ukraine for the last couple of weeks. We've been talking about some supposed threat from the United States toward Greenland. We haven't been looking at some of the most pressing international problems that pose real and tangible threats to Canada and to the Western Alliance. Instead, we've been navel-gazing collectively.
Let me just add a historical analogy here. No historical analogy is perfect, but this one, I think we can learn something from it. Korea, 1950. North Korea, supported by Russia, or Soviet Union at the time, and Communist China, did not believe that South Korea was in the United States sphere of interest. Well, it turned out it was, and look what happened. And the same thing could happen today.
All right, let me just re-rack here for a second, because for those who joined us late, we want to remind everybody here that we are in Hangar A of the Bombardier Center for Aerospace and Aviation at Centennial College's dedicated aerospace campus. It's part of DARE, Downsview Aerospace Innovation and Research. And let me reintroduce our guests. They are retired General Wayne Eyre, who was Canada's Chief of Defence Staff from 2021 to 24. Wendy Gilmore is here, former Assistant Secretary General for Defence Investment at NATO, among many major external affairs postings. And Christian Leuprecht is here, Distinguished Professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and Queen's University. Here's a weird way to get into this next subject. We are sitting here taping this in the last weekend of January, which means last night at the Scotiabank Arena, Mitch Marner made his return to a Toronto audience. And strangely enough, I was at the game and some guy started to talk to me. What did he talk to me about? Mitch Marner's return? No. He wanted to talk to me about whether we should buy the F-35s or the Swedish Griffin plane. And seemed like an odd place to have that conversation, but my hunch is if somebody's raising it at a hockey game, then it has reached the level of interest where Canadians across the country are fascinated by this conundrum we now face. And so, well, let's take a moment here. We could talk about this for hours, but we're not going to. Let's take a moment here and talk about whether we should be buying as many as 88 CF-35s, or F-35s, excuse me, from the Americans, or whether the Swedish option is a better way to go. Okay, Christian, start us off.
So look, Canadian governments have a long history of using defense investments really as an economic strategy. And we're not the only country in the world. And I think the trade-off is always, is it going to be a lowercase d and a capital I, or is it going to be a capital D and a lowercase I? And inherently, politicians, whether it's cabinet, caucus, or parliament, are going to be looking at what is this going to be doing for me if I'm going to be investing all this money. But we have a curious, I think, effect at work here. Usually budgeting works by you go to the department, you do a threat analysis, you try to figure out what the department needs. Here, we decided we're going to get to an arbitrary spending point. And I'm still not quite sure how we came up with the figure that the Prime Minister's office is throwing out there, because my math works differently than theirs, but irrespective of that. And so now we're trying to figure out what we're actually going to be spending it on. And I think that's sort of the important point of the show, right? So asking the conversation, asking to what end? Is it to protect the continent? Is it for force projection? Is it for contribution warfare so we can curry favor with the United States and with other allies? Or is it first and foremost to drive the Canadian economy at a time sort of when we have challenges in terms of our possibly declining standard of living and the like, and those are challenging political trade-offs. And I think we always need to remember, and I think this is also what I take away from General Eyre and from Wendy, that, and generals usually don't like it when I say this, the Canadian Armed Forces are first and foremost not a defense organization, they are a political instrument. The same with NATO. The North American and Atlantic Council is the chief civilian authority over NATO, that it is ultimately at the disposal of politicians to achieve political ends that they believe to be in the best interests of the country.
Okay, these two want in.
Yeah,
And defense, defense is one instrument in a broad toolkit that increasingly we need to use multiple instruments together to achieve that effect.
Okay, I'm going to answer the question. We are already buying the F-35. We
but
are
only
under
18
contract for an initial, and I always forget it, 16 that we are coming in. And we are then have an option for additional aircraft. One of the things, and Christian spoke about some of the challenges for defense procurement, we need to stop beating ourselves up about decisions we've already taken, and we need capability now. The F-18, CF-18s are coming to the end of their natural life. We need an air capability to protect our own interests. Now, there are issues with the F-35 that I can identify, not the least of which is the political challenges of the states, but on an ongoing basis, are we able to get the necessary software upgrades, ongoing engagement on that aircraft if the Americans don't want us to have it? That's an issue no matter what technology we access.
Do you want 88 of them, though?
That's not a question that I'm prepared to answer as a call it diplomat, political expert. Our Air Force should be able to say, these are the tasks, this is how many aircraft government we need to fulfill those tasks. If you don't want to give us that many aircraft, this is the smaller box of tasks that we can perform.
But the Air Force cannot make the political, I don't think, not make the political judgment of how do we respond to the U.S. screwing us over right now?
So there is, first of all, the CF-30, it will be a CF-35, right? Anyway, our designation of the F-35 is a global aircraft. There is a global fleet. It is going to be in use in many of our NATO allies. It's in use in Japan, in Australia, and elsewhere around the world. That global fleet will continue to be there, to be sustained. And it is, emotionally, I'd perhaps say to hell with the Americans right now because I don't like your president. But we need capability, and these aircraft are currently under production, and we're going to get them soon. Had we stuck with the original contract, we'd already be flying the F-35 right now. That doesn't mean to say is that we shouldn't. Now there are additional resources, and the government needs to understand what those resources need to be, that we need to look at sovereign capabilities and answering to our own interests. But right now, let's just get the bloody aircraft. Enough
okay, General.
Couple of points. Hey, let me address Christian's point about generals and politics. War is an extension of politics, as Clausewitz famously said, but it is a fundamental of military professionalism in a democracy that the military is subservient to duly elected civilian officials. And we follow orders and drive on, whatever the decision is. And I saw many times as Chief of Defense Staff where my advice was not taken, or it was taken in consideration of other factors well beyond the military sphere. And so we have to realize that. Secondly, on the F-35 in particular, hey, we know the F-35 is the most capable of the options.
And most expensive.
Yes, and we saw that, we saw the F-35s in use over Iran from the Israelis, penetrating their air defense and going ahead there. And so what decision is going to be, at the end of the day, a political decision, not a military decision. And the military will have to live with whatever decision is made. But all that being said, I think we can use this as an opportunity to springboard to the next generation of fighters. We need to be thinking about the rapidly changing character of war, how wars are being fought, which is underpinned by that rapid technological change that I've talked about before. This next fighter, we need to adopt something called the collaborative combat aircraft So a loyal wingman, that is an unmanned aircraft that is tethered to a crewed aircraft, and use that as a springboard to the next generation of completely uncrewed, autonomous fighters. Easy for a guy from an Army background to say, especially with a whole bunch of aircraft behind me that had pilots. But I think that's where we need to go. And at the same time, really engage Canadian aerospace industry on this.
But let me ask the follow-up. Sweden is offering that if we buy their plane, they'll build it here.
Yeah.
Should that matter in our decision making?
Well, from a political level, you have to decide, is capability more important than jobs? And if we take a look at the Gripen, a great aircraft for right now, is probably half a generation behind of most modern, but we're going to have this aircraft for 20, 30, 40 years. Where's it going to be then?
Wendy, what's your view?
So in a procurement timeline, and I spent a little bit of time in a procurement world, so I can't speak for them, but I can speak about them. We have a now problem, we have a 5-year out problem, and then we have a longer term, call that the development, the technological drift problem. The now problem is the lifespan of our current CF-18s and our need to provide capability right now. We are in, and maybe I'll not skew the conversation too much, but we're in a conflict with Russia right now. We, as Canada, are facing hybrid attacks. Our allies in Europe are facing daily hybrid attacks. The Russians are testing the defenses of NATO. We need to have capability to bring to the fight in a very short order, if that were required. We're buying aircraft possibly for the next 25, 30 years, unless we are in a situation in which there is significant attrition, in which case those aircraft could be gone tomorrow and we would need something to follow them. So we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, which is we need a fleet now, we need a fleet a few years from now, which is what we'll get out of the ones that we're already under contract to receive. Then we need to think about how are we positioning ourselves with allies, because the one thing that Canada has learned back with the Avro Aero story is that we do not have the resources ourselves to develop a completely unique capability. So we have to choose the partners we're going to work with, but we also need manufacturing and advanced manufacturing capabilities in Canada. And that's frankly one of the things the F-35 has done for us to date. And I have ultimately, if we were under contract to take the Gripen, I'd say let's carry on with the Gripen. I just believe in getting on with doing what we've said we were going to do. But we went, one of my favorite things to quote is in 1939, we had no shipbuilding industry to speak of whatsoever. By 1945, we were the 4th largest shipbuilder in the world. This facility that we're sitting on right now was producing thousands of aircraft that was developed over the course of a short couple of years. What I believe we need right now is the Canadian public to provide the political will necessary to our government to get on with the business of reconstituting our forces, rebuilding Canadian capability, and at the same time making sure we have the manufacturing ability to continue to sustain it.
Last quick word on this.
So qualitatively, the Gripen and the F-35 are completely different entities. The F-35 is a digital platform that, among other things, happens to fly. So we also, in terms of procurement, there's 3 things you want to accomplish, right? You want to get it on a timeline, there's the cost, and there's the capabilities. And those are difficult trade-offs. And I would say on most procurement projects, you have to compromise on one of those. It seems in Canada, we can never do any 3 of those. And let me tell you, our colleagues in Washington and among allies, it drives them completely insane every time we walk back a commitment. And the reputational cost, in particular to Canada, of constantly making performative announcements and then walking them back is ultimately incalculable in terms of the consequences that we suffer from that. And I'll close on this. One of my US colleagues like to say, ultimately, when it comes to defense, it's up to the people to decide, and the people are allowed to be wrong. The problem is, I would say, in terms of civil-military relations in this country, and with all respect to the very challenging circumstances that our chiefs of defense staff find themselves in, we live in an era where we need to have a much more robust conversation between the defense and security establishment and the political authority. And in my view, we have been too subservient because it is also up to the organizations to explain to Canadians the rapidly changing threat environment, kinetic nuclear hybrid that we are living in and the very homeopathic posture that we have. And the importance of the program here is precisely to do that, because if we're going to spend billions on defense and possibly asking Canadians to make significant sacrifices in order to do that, we need to get social license for those expenditures. And I'm not sure that the organizations and the institutions or our political leadership has done enough of the heavy lifting, but I think we're starting to see that out of some of the discourse politically.
I want to give this audience the heads up that we're going to do one more round up here, and then we'll put a microphone in the middle right there, and we'll get you to take your questions at that point. So let's do one last thing here, and that is, okay, I want to know what's on your wish list. General, we're apparently going to be spending tens of billions of dollars over the next X number of years rearming and reinvigorating our military. What do you want to spend that money on?
How much time do we have? Okay, so firstly, our strategic culture is changing, and we need to be focused much more at home. Our strategic culture up to now has been expeditionary in nature, and we've preferred away games to home games. Well, the home game now is absolutely number one priority. So we need to know what's happening. So what we call all domain awareness, from space to the seabed, especially in the Arctic. So sensor technology, infrastructure in the north, so that we can project capabilities from the south. I'm not talking about permanent basing in the north, but persistent presence by projecting capabilities from the south to the north. We need to maintain some expeditionary capability so that we can help influence the emerging order, so that we have a seat at the table, or at least can whisper in the ear to somebody who's got a seat at the table.
How many people would that require?
I'm not prepared to put a number out right now, but certainly more than what we've got now. 100,000, 120,000 regulars, perhaps, but don't quote me on that. I guess it's too late to say that. But there's a number of capabilities with the evolving character of war that goes with it. Far more autonomous systems. You know, we've got a habit of investing in these really expensive, high-end, exquisite systems that if you lose your lose in the first weeks of combat, it's going to be bad for you. We need to invest much more in mass-produced, attritable systems.
Attritable meaning?
Meaning you can lose them without problem. Think drones in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. A $50,000 drone that if you lose,
it's not
so be it. But if you take out a $2 million tank, well, excellent, good on you, because there's an economics of defense that's happening here. So we do need some of those high-end exquisite systems, but we also got to invest in those rapidly changing mass-produced systems.
Gotcha. Okay. Wendy, what's on your list?
So I spent much of my life as a bureaucrat. What's on my list is a system and process that is empowered to make rapid decisions, that can evolve as it's need to. We talked in NATO a lot about the time, it's the speed of relevance. So we need a system that can move at the speed of relevance, which is bloody fast. We have been promised a Defence Investment Agency by the government that is to be a single decision maker. There's still a lot of challenges with standing up that apparatus. It's not all about process. I mean, it doesn't matter what process you have. If you have the political will to take decisions and move things out, it will happen quickly. So my wish list is clear, unambiguous decision-making ability to make decisions and to make them in such a way that we can evolve to meet the speed of what is necessary.
Can you give us a for instance on that? What does that look like?
Well, for instance, we've already seen a little bit of it, which is, I would say, slightly encouraging, which is the government has said, all right, we need a submarine capability to not just replace the one I have, but to build that capability. So in very rapid order, they went, instead of going through a long process that is prioritized to protect against procurement risk, they've said we've down selected to 2 different suppliers, one in Korea, one in Germany. There's a very expedited process going on right now to say, all right, give us your best bids that you can, and we're going to take a decision. And what I would like to see, the practical outcome is we're going to make a decision, and it's not going to be good for the people that lose, but whatever, we've made a decision, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to get that submarine into operations, into a capability as soon as possible.
And one last follow-up. At the end of the day,
yeah,
does the Minister of Defense make that call? Does the Prime Minister make the call? Who makes the call?
So the legal authority to buy or otherwise acquire capability for the Canadian Forces is the Minister of Public Services and Procurement Canada.
Oh, neither one.
So
okay.
Ultimately, though, these types of decisions tend to be a cabinet decision. But what cabinet needs to do is say, here are our criteria, let the process assess the bids, whichever one meets that criteria, then let's move on with it. As opposed to what we've seen many, many times, including with the F-35 right now, is that we go back and we revisit the criteria over and over again. Yes, circumstances change, things happen, but at some point, in order to get real pieces of equipment like we have behind us, you actually need to make a decision and just do it.
Gotcha. Christian, what's on your list?
3 quick things. The first is, we came out of World War II with the 4th largest military in the world, if you don't count the Wehrmacht having been resoundingly defeated. And we said to ourselves, what we experienced during the first half of the 20th century, this is not the world that we want to live in. And we invested aggressively in instruments of statecraft and in multilateral institutions to shape the environment of the second half of the 20th century. And I would say we have forgotten the opportunity. We are reacting. We don't have the initiative. How do we get back the initiative? Where's the Canadian politician that actually has a vision and a strategy of the country and the world that we want to live in 5, 10, and 25 years from now, and the investments that we are going to make to that end?
Can I just ask you to answer that question? Do you see that politician out there right now?
Well, for better or for worse, as much as we want to impugn some of our US colleagues, and I always like to say, look, none of us, at least I'm not a dual citizen, so I don't get a vote. Moralizing what happens in the United States is not helpful. But at least in the United States, for better or for worse, there's a very active political conversation about the future of the United States and what country America wants to be and what role it should play in the world. And clearly the Trump administration, rightly or wrongly, has decided we are going to play a very different role in this very different world from sort of breaking with past continuity.
Okay.
The 2 other key points. How many shows like yours have I done where people say, we should be working for peace. We shouldn't be putting money into defense. And I would say this is exactly what gets us in trouble. Because implicit in that statement is, the Americans will do it for us if we get in trouble. And if we take that approach, then we're exactly back to when you took us at the beginning. My late colleague Niels Orvik, defense from help. What are we investing in? In capabilities to defending ourselves from circumstances where the US administration says, let us help you. Because when the US comes in and says, let us help you when it comes to our national security, whether it comes to financial crime, to cartels, to human trafficking, to defense and whatnot, we are compromising our own political and economic sovereignty as a result. And rightly or wrongly, the frustration in Washington with Canada goes well beyond the current Trump administration. And so this is an investment in defense from help. This is an investment in our political and economic sovereignty. And to play it full circle, coming back to 1775, British troops had whoever our was at the time, our back. Today, there's no one that has our back. It is entirely up to us as Canadians what sovereignty we ultimately want to have and protect and what role we want this country to play.
You want to pick apart any of that?
Nope.
Okay.
I want to hear from them.
Okay, friends, we have a microphone in the aisle. We would encourage you to line up behind the microphone. If you wouldn't mind, just give us your first name and where you're coming from, and then fire away. Yes, sir. Thank you for starting us off.
Zach, Toronto. My question to the panel is, how much of the holding of the procurement for F-35 is in relation to the trade deal and using that as a carrot? And how often are military procurements used for trade negotiations? Thank you.
So formally, they are, of course, completely disconnected. You asked about in the past. One of the recent examples was when Boeing was pursuing what we felt to be very unfair trade practices against Canada, the United States against Canada. There was a policy enacted by the Canadian government that said where companies are not acting in Canada's interest, they should not be part of public procurement. That said, there is, of course, a calculus going on inside the Government of Canada trying to understand how do they get to a point in engaging with the United States that we can protect what we need, which is access to the American market. Because there's a broader economic sovereignty, frankly, our own economic stability is based at the moment still because of access to the US market. So it's a difficult decision that our government has, but there's no direct line from one to the other. They'll be looking at a whole suite of different capabilities and different decisions as part of that process.
Christian.
Zach, here's my frustration with Canada on this, right? So going back to the Avro Arrow, F-35, we've already invested hundreds of millions of your and my tax dollars. The submarine decision, the German-Norwegian consortium is writing its software in a company headquartered in Canada. We're about to do it with Canadian Nuclear Laboratories in the way that contract is structured. We generate Canadian intellectual property, world-leading intellectual property, here in Canada, and then we effectively give it away. And we either decide we're not going to procure the technology, we're just going to walk away from it, or we structure our IP contracts in ways that doesn't protect it, or we have research security that effectively lets our adversaries in China and Iran take that intellectual property. And so I think the investments that we have already made in the technology, why would we walk away from it, given that we've already, this is our return on investment. This is how we remain a high-tech innovation country, because if you look at the intellectual property and you look at how much of it is generated in the United States relative to Canada, our partners in the Indo-Pacific, and our allies in Europe, the leading IP development remains in the United States. And so it's up to us that if we're already investing in it, we might as well keep it here and capitalize on it.
Christian, have you been talking to Jim Balsillie lately? He's been beating this drum for a long time. You want a word on this, or are you good?
No, I'm good.
You're good. Okay. Next, please.
Hi, Nicholas from Toronto as well.
Hi, Nicholas.
My question is regarding recently India and Russia signed an Arctic defense agreement, giving them access to Arctic naval ports and logistics. How must Canada think about non-Arctic state actors getting a vested interest in the Arctic now?
Who wants in on that? You want to
I mean,
start?
I can start, but I think
well, you go ahead and I'll jump in.
So Canadian policy to date has been that the Arctic nations should have the first voice in the management. Frankly, Arctic peoples have the first voice, and Arctic nations have the voice in the management of this territory. I can't speak to the India-Russia agreement. I'm not familiar with it, but our position would continue to be that the primary interest in the Arctic has to be the people that live there, and it's our responsibility to protect their interests.
General.
Yeah, so much like China, they have an interest for resource extraction and shipping routes. And again, thinking in strategic timelines, so decades ahead as much as climate change has an effect up there. What's going to happen? Well, you're going to see fish protein migrate north. And so much like the devastating fishing fleets that China has across the world, well, those will move north as well. And India is looking at that as well. And so, yeah, we need to be concerned about what happens in our backyard in the Arctic. It may not be within the Canada's EEZ, but certainly close enough.
EEZ?
Exclusive
economic zone.
Got it.
Sorry for the acronyms. China has been doing a tremendous amount of research in the Arctic. A couple of ships, the Zhuilong 2, have been up there every summer. In fact, they probably have a better picture of the seabed than the Americans do in many places. So what's that for? Resource extraction? Submarines? Yeah, a lot of it's dual use.
Christian?
Yeah, I think this is precisely why we need to be able to assert our sovereignty in the Arctic against clearly people who have a very active and in some cases quite aggressive interests in the Arctic. But I also think we need to keep that in context. So everybody loves to talk about the Northwest Passage. If you've been up there and you've seen the Northwest Passage, you know it is too shallow and it is too narrow for the large container ships that we have today. What happens when you get out of the Northwest Passage? Well, you're in Greenland. You are hundreds of miles away from the next serious port infrastructure. And the third is you can't actually pay the insurance rates to go through the north, because it is, imagine if you have sort of an accident up there and you ultimately have to clean that up. So I think we also need to keep in context, yes, adversaries have a keen interest, but how that will actually manifest in an area that is really hard to access and relatively would require huge investments, I think, by the Canadian government in terms of critical infrastructure to make it profitable for people to invest, something very different. Of course, your predecessor, I think, has a famous quote about, like, you know, if one of these adversaries deployed to the Arctic, what's the first thing that he would do? He would send out a search party.
Yeah, well, search and rescue, which is another important point.
Yeah.
Because a manifestation of national sovereignty is the ability to do search and rescue within your own territory. And if you don't do it, somebody else will. I was in Taiwan for a week in September, and I saw manufactured crises of ships in trouble that China was exploiting to gradually erode Taiwanese sovereignty. Ship in trouble, dispatch Chinese search and rescue into Taiwanese waters.
Yeah.
There's a model perhaps for our north in the years to come.
We've got a bit of a line here, so I want to encourage nice, snappy questions and nice, snappy answers too, if I can. Go ahead, please.
Hi, George from Vaughan. I just also want to say thank you, Steve, for being here, and to the panel, thank you for coming out during this cold snap that we've been having, so appreciated. Just very quickly, can you speak to the industrial strategy that Canada has and the dual-use policy that we've been trying to implement, and how on board our allies are on this topic? And can you just mention the roadblocks that this policy might have? Thank you.
So I think the first roadblock is getting the policy out. We heard before Christmas that it was going to be out by Christmas. Didn't say what year. But I think when the strategy comes out, we should be happy. But until then, we can't really talk about it.
I would just say it is a defense industrial strategy. Its first purpose should be to make sure that we have the industrial base necessary to support the Canadian Armed Forces. Its second purpose is to make sure that we are protecting the Indigenous intellectual property, the other technology that is Canadian that we need. And its third priority is to help the Canadian economy and make sure we have economic benefit. I just want to make sure that those priorities are not reversed.
This guy's got the right shirt for today. Okay, here we go.
Yes. We do live in a great country. That's why I wore that. I think it's helpful to remember. I think that was mentioned on the panel. And the Arctic, I lived up in Nunavut. I saw people there, and just wondering if you could talk more about the Rangers, their involvement, and how is more being developed with the Inuit people and their involvement as they have been with Arctic sovereignty.
General.
Yeah, so the Rangers, for everybody who is not familiar with them, they're a great organization. About 5,000 across the country, just over 1,000 up in the Arctic area. They live in the communities. They are part-time reservists. They are the eyes, ears, and guides for the Canadian military across the extremities of our country. They help a lot with RCMP and ground search and rescue. And their role is going to continue to evolve as we focus more and more on Arctic security. But as we've seen over the course of the last number of decades, they provide tremendous service to Canada.
Christian, quick follow-up?
There's about as many people who live in the north as live in my hometown of Kingston. And they're extremely vulnerable communities. But if you talk to them, what is their priority? When you talk to them about security and defense, it's human security issues. It's food security. It's energy security. And that gets back to the previous question, that what we need to invest in is dual use, or in the north, it is multi-use, ultimately, investments in critical infrastructure and in technology that need to benefit our local quasi-sovereign partners.
Very good. Thanks for the question. Next, please.
Hi, I'm Aiden. My question is, what should Canada's military priorities be in the next decade? Territorial defense, international peacekeeping, or alliance commitments, for example, NATO, and why?
You want to know what the top priority should be of that list?
Okay, well, top priority is the home game. So protecting Canada at home, and specifically more and more the Arctic. Peacekeeping, hey, I saw the death of peacekeeping in the former Yugoslavia in 93 at the Battle of Medak Pocket, where the thin veneer of civilization was ripped away. And our myth of interpositional peacekeeping that was developed in the 60s, that is gone. And that type of peacekeeping is not coming back. Supporting our allies where we can overseas, yeah, absolutely, but we've got to be very disciplined as to where we put our forces. Our last defense policy, our North Strong and Free, gave us a number of tiers. Top tier, defending the country and specific focus on the Arctic. And then the transatlantic relationship and Indo-Pacific. We can only spread the spread our butter on the toast so thin, to quote Bilbo Baggins. We can only do so much.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yes, sir.
Richard from Burlington, thank you all for coming today. I was hoping you'd be able to expand on a couple of things that have confused me from your responses. Talk of need for Canada to invest in being able to monitor our north. Is that not part of the Saab Gripen proposal? Not only are they saying buy planes from us, but also the GoldenEye plane built on a Canadian airframe, allowing us to patrol and maintain control over our own north. We are investing with Australia in a sea to space radar system to be built in the north. I believe we annoyed some Americans by not buying their system. Do not these deals with nations other than America expand our abilities, show our commitment to our neighbors, and also give us industry here in Canada, to your point of an attritable resource? F-35, wonderful plane, but very, very expensive, whereas the Gripen is less expensive, has greater room for growth.
How do you know so much about this? That's what I want to
read
know.
one or two things. And if you lose it, we can rebuild it right here in Canada because the plant is here, versus if we lose an F-35, we're at the end of a waiting list. So if you had some insight into that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, so we just got to be careful about silver bullet systems. And we're talking about sensors. What we need are layered sensors. So the Australian system you talked about was the Arctic Over-the-Horizon radar. So it's, think a ground-based radar. The aircraft you're talking about fills what's known as an airborne early warning system. So think of a plane-mounted radar system. We also need space-based systems. So we have those layers of sensors so that we've got some redundancy. Again, going back to 2023 and shooting down balloons, one of the things that was driven home to me was the lack of ground-based radar coverage that our country has. And the reason we took down a balloon in Yukon was I was afraid we were going to lose it as it came closer or as it moved into the Canadian interior, because we don't have that coverage. So it's that layer system that's important.
If I would just add in the one point you absolutely made, which I think is very important, is that we have to have relationships with a lot of different allies. We do not want all of our capabilities in one bucket. And if we've learned anything over the course of the last months or so in the changing rhetoric coming out of the American administration, is that we have been overly dependent on the US for our source of technology, our economic prosperity, and others. So the partnership with Australia, very important. Partnership with European allies, we now have the foundation to get even more down into that space with the signing of a defense cooperation arrangement with the European Union. As the Europeans develop more sovereign capabilities, working with Canada is also going to be in their interest. I think focusing too much on individual pieces of equipment is exactly, we tend to go down a rabbit hole, F-35 versus the Gripen. Well, we have an F-35 contract right now. We will need something that will follow it, whether that continues to be the same piece of equipment or a different one or different capabilities. That's what we have to try and focus on.
Christian.
And we talk a lot about the kit, but what we really need to talk about is the people, because regardless of buying a plane, we're going to need pilots for that plane, we're going to need technicians, we're going to need submariners, we're going to need Mars officers, and we already have trouble generating the crews that we need today. So my worry is we're going to buy this wonderful equipment, and then we're not going to have the people to operate. If you look at it was a great question, because the question indicates the breadth of what we're asking the Canadian Armed Forces to do today relative to what we asked them to do at the end of the Cold War. We're asking them to do ever more things in terms of quantity, quality, and complexity. And relative to that, even with the additional investment, we continue to see sort of relative declining resources for this growing number of tasks. So it's first and foremost about, for me, it's about the people, not the kit.
I think it's also important. I think one of the great things is I just saw something released in the last few days that there have been more applicants for the Canadian Forces in the last 12 months than anticipated, significant numbers of people. And I look at all of the young people in the room and I would say there is a great career for you in the forces, supporting the forces, in industry. Go study STEM.
Couldn't say it better myself.
I was going to say, you're not going to, no argument from this guy here. We have time for 2 more questions, so yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Saurav, and I have an AI consulting firm in Toronto, and we mostly operate in fintech and e-commerce space.
Okay.
So someone coming from totally non-traditional background, like outside from aerospace and defense, is there any meaningful way I can make contribution to this sector in future?
Is there a meaningful way he can make a contribution to this sector?
And so you said you're involved with AI?
AI, yeah.
Yeah, and fintech.
And
fintech,
yes,
fintech.
and fintech. So, much in the wider national security sphere, fintech is becoming increasingly important. As we see security threats to Canada manifest, there's a security nexus to so many things. Finance is right at the top. So getting involved in financial security for the country, essential.
Christian.
So we talk about national security, but I think the challenge is then that makes it sound like the federal government or defense can somehow solve these problems on their own. And given the complexity of the challenges, given the types of threat vectors that we have, it requires a whole of government and a whole of society approach where defense sort of plays just one role. And you've seen the Prime Minister announce a significant increase in the primary reserves, a significant increase in the supplementary reserves. But also, I think what we haven't done particularly well is provide exactly the sort of motivated individuals that want to do something for their country to be able to pitch in and to find those mechanisms.
So who does he call?
I would say there is we have been promised another, beyond the defense industrial strategy, the government has announced that it will be launching a platform for a new type of supplementary reserve to allow Canadians to sign up and to let their capabilities be known. I'm really anxious to see what that looks like. And I'd also, the recruiting center is right downtown.
Going to Christian's point, what we need is national resilience. Right down to the provincial, territorial, and municipal levels, a sense of self-reliance, the ability to rely on yourself, and not just wait for help from the federal government with that learned helplessness. Because the security threats are manifesting, not just man-made threats, but natural disasters as well. The increasing frequency and intensity of natural disasters is something that we really need to worry about. And so municipal governments have a role in this as well, and including in fintech and AI.
Interesting. No pressure, but you've got the last question.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, I'm Danilo from Toronto, and you'll have to forgive me for how broad this may be, but I wanted to talk about the motif, the narrative, the notion, whatever you want to characterize it as, Canada, its identity as a peacekeeping nation. And as we all know, geopolitics and world events are very fluctuating, and this has been talked about throughout the whole conversation, but I just wanted to know, long-term, should we still stick by that moniker? Should that be something that other world leaders and countries should see as the first thing they identify with Canada? And should we stick by it? Or should there be some new ideas to the table, so to speak?
So I think that was a certain period in our history. And hey, I wore a blue beret on two missions overseas. But that was a short period in our rather longer military history. Hey, World War I, we put 600,000 in uniform, 60,000 killed in action. World War II, we put 1.1 million in uniform, far more than on any peacekeeping mission. Korean War, the same thing. The war in Afghanistan, the same thing. And so focusing on the ability to defend our country and doing it from a position of confidence is where I think we need to go.
I think General Eyre already said our idea of this, the neutral military party that goes in to separate two warring factions has been over since the 1990s. And it was probably over before we realized it was over, as experienced in some very difficult places.
When they were shooting at me, I realized it was over.
Exactly. So one of the things that we have to realize is that there may be times when Canada will need to defend our own interests by helping to resolve conflicts in other parts of the world. But we need to take those decisions in view of how is it contributing and what is the most effective way to do that. And I think what we've learned certainly in the last few decades is that strong, capable military forces that have the mandate, the rules of engagement, the equipment to defend themselves and defend others maybe need to be deployed, but that's not peacekeeping, and we should let go of the idea that there is somehow this magic third-party interpositional blue beret peacekeeper out there that we can go back to being, because that does not exist anymore.
Christian.
What does peacekeeping come out of? 1956, the Suez Crisis. Why did Pearson effectively invent the concept? to avoid the superpowers from going to war, possibly going to nuclear war. Because we would all lose if that was going to happen. Peacekeeping was never about making the world a better, nicer place. But I think politically we turned it into that because that's a cheap and easy thing to do. What did we do after World War II? We invested in real capabilities that we, as both Wayne and General Ayer have pointed out, deployed to Europe. Why did we deploy them to Europe? Because what did we learn in the first half of the 20th century? That the Europeans like to fight their wars right down to the last Canadian. And I point that out because, look, we're learning it today with Ukraine. What happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe. It has effects on the whole world. It has effects on the instability that we're seeing in the Arctic today. And so it is these are investments in stability. These are investments in defending the democracy and the way of life that we cherish.
If I can just add to Christian's point. So a year and a half ago, 80th anniversary of the Normandy landings. I was there on Juno Beach. And as I reflected on it, I realized as Canada at the spearhead, at the first, amongst the first to land in Normandy and spearheaded the liberation of Europe, we are a country capable of great things. And we have done great things. We just need that confidence and that belief in ourselves. But we can do it.
In light of that comment, I want to give you the last word on something that was said by the President of the United States the other day, in which he said, essentially, the U.S. did all the heavy lifting in the wars that took place earlier this century, and Canadian and British and other allied troops kind of held back. What did your view of that sound like?
It's hard not to take it personally. In 2007, as a unit commander, I lost 10 Canadians under my command. I've known many more who were killed over there, ranging from 2002 right up until the end of our commitment. It was a comment designed to spark outrage. It was a troll. We were being trolled. And I would, I guess my message to my fellow veterans would be, don't fall prey to the troll. Don't fall prey to that sense of outrage. We know what we did. And our American colleagues who stood shoulder to shoulder with us, the ones that matter, they know what we did. And so be proud of your service there. You did everything your country asked you to do.
That's a very powerful final statement here. Okay, we do need to say some thank yous before we sign off on our broadcast here. First, to this audience. By the time this plays on television, people may have forgotten that it's bloody cold out there today, and yet you folks showed up in big numbers here, even filled the bleachers, so thank you very much for coming out today. And for those of you who stepped up and asked questions, our thanks to you as well. To the folks here at Centennial College and the DARE Hub, especially Michelle Irvin, Samantha Glover, you have been a delight to work with. Thank you for your hospitality. This is a hell of a set, I gotta say. Really nice, really nice. To our TVO staff and production crew, many thanks as always. You guys always bring it on the road and make it look so easy. To Hillary Clark, who produced TVO Today Live. Hillary, if the Premier were here, he'd say, you're a champion. As always, to the Wilson Foundation and its benefactor, Red Wilson, for enabling everything that we have done on this series. And everybody in this room today is here free of charge because of Red Wilson. And now thanks as well to the Jackman Foundation for their contribution as well. For more in this series, you can go to tvo.org/TVO Today Live, or you can check out our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/@TVO Today. And finally, I know this audience wants to join me in thanking this wonderful trio for being here today at Centennial College and helping us out with this discussion. Thank you so much, everybody. Well done. I'm Steve Paikin. Thank you and good night. Good night, everybody.
TVO Today Live is made possible by the generous support of the Wilson Foundation.